Hello, everybody, and welcome to Pint of Science 2021 from Cambridge. We are very sorry about the problems we had for the previous live, so we just would like to remind you that this video will stay on. So if you are not able to catch the end of it, you will be able to see it again in the next days or months or years, whenever you want. So please bear with us. We had some technical problems and we had to end the previous live. So we would have loved to meet in a pub, isn't it? We would have had less problems, of course. But for this year, we have to do it online. But at least we can be together from different places. So where are you from? Where are you watching this video from? Let us know through the comments. So we will be talking about climate change and conservation after COVID-19. What's next? This would be an online roundtable, a live roundtable, with Dr. Chris Sandbrook, who is a conservation scientist at the Department of Geography here in Cambridge, and Hugh Hunt, who is a climate engineer at the Department of Engineering here in Cambridge too. So this roundtable will be moderated by Ellie Bladon, who is a zoologist and a science communicator and broadcaster from the Department of Zoology. So please grab your drinks and let's be ready to hear Ellie, that will introduce the topic for us. And then she will be followed by Chris and you, who will dig deeper into their specific expertises. Please be aware that there's a feedback form in the bottom of the description of the video. Please give us feedback so you will be able to join a draw for amazing Pint of Science prizes. And please remember to ask any question you may have through the comment section. We will be very happy to answer them as soon as the discussion starts. So I will leave the floor to Ali now. And thank you for being here and for being with our problems before.
Hello, and welcome to this roundtable discussion on climate change and conservation after the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, all of us have probably heard the term climate change thrown about, from experts on the news to your mate down the pub. But what is climate change and why do we care? Why are scientists discussing the difference between 1.5 degrees centigrade and 2 degrees centigrade of warming? And what has the Paris Agreement got to do with all of this? Well, we just didn't want this to consist of us talking about climate change, but instead getting into a good discussion of the issues, with questions from you, of course. But before launching into that, I'm just going to quickly go through the main reasons why climate change is such an important issue at the moment, and one that if you watch TV or listen to the radio, you probably can't get away from. Well, since the Industrial Revolution, humans have been burning fossil fuels like coal, oil and gas for energy, to heat our homes, to power our factories and to propel our vehicles. When we burn fossil fuels, we release large quantities of carbon dioxide gas, which then trap heat in our atmosphere, leading to a warming world. The Earth goes through cycles of heating and cooling over the timescale of hundreds of thousands of years. But at the moment, we're in the midst of an unprecedentedly fast warming period, which corresponds directly onto our increase in carbon dioxide emissions. CO2 contributes to global warming because, along with other greenhouse gases like methane, nitrous oxide, and CFCs, it absorbs radiation from the sun and stops it from escaping back into space. We're already seeing drastic changes on Earth resulting from this heating. So much so that scientists believe that we're entering a new geological period, the Anthropocene. Now, more people are taking notice of these extreme global changes, but it's widely accepted that whilst many of us can make changes that reduce our personal carbon footprints, change is needed at a larger scale. Governments have been encouraged to take responsibility for their part in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In December 2015, at the Paris Climate Conference, 196 countries and states met, discussed and ultimately accepted a legally binding treaty to reduce their carbon emissions, with the goal of keeping global warming to less than 2 degrees centigrade, and preferably less than 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. But what do 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees C even refer to? Well, it's currently about 15 degrees in Cambridge, so an extra couple of degrees actually sounds quite nice. But when we talk about 2 degrees centigrade of warming, that's an average over the globe and throughout the year. So while some places, particularly at sea, might heat by less than a degree and some seasons will be cooler, other places at other times could see increases of up to 10 degrees centigrade. Increases on this scale will have profound effects on weather patterns, crop viability, ecosystem functioning, and ultimately human health. Now, that number on its own might sound quite abstract, but what would it mean in practical terms? Well, at 1.5 degrees C of warming, we will see more frequent droughts in the Mediterranean, South Africa, South America, and Australia. This will lead to crop failures and a reduction in available drinking water. The drier environments will also make wildfires more frequent and violent. But at the same time, this level of global warming will increase the frequency and unpredictability of extreme storms, meaning that at higher latitudes, like here in the UK, and in mountainous regions, will be much more at risk of flooding. While it's predicted that tropical cyclones may get less frequent, it is expected that they will become more violent, with greater levels of rain when they do occur. Now, these weather changes will affect animals' habitats too, with many species seeing their habitats decrease and in some cases disappear completely. Just as one example, this graph from a paper by Rasmont et al. Shows the predicted changes in climatically suitable habitat for bumblebees in Europe under 2 different scenarios of emissions at 2 different time points, with the 2 right-hand panels representing a scenario with higher continuing emissions and subsequently a higher loss in bumblebee habitats, shown by the red colouring. Some species will persevere and adapt, but there will also be an increased risk of invasive species spreading to new environments, with negative consequences for native flora and fauna. Warming is expected to be more intense on land than at sea, but marine environments are very sensitive to warming, so we're already seeing the negative consequences of warming in the oceans. As the sea warms, the water won't hold as much oxygen, leading to dead zones where the low oxygen content is inhospitable to most marine organisms. The sea actually absorbs a large amount of our excess carbon dioxide, but this makes the water acidic, and this combination of warmer and more acidic water leads to coral bleaching, essentially the death of huge numbers of corals on once vibrant reefs. As seawater warms, it also expands, so in combination with the heavier rains, warming water will contribute to more flooding, and the warming temperatures are also causing melting of the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets, which will also lead to sea levels rising. So, all of this sounds intensely negative. What are our options? Well, most governments have failed on their promises under the Paris Climate Agreement, and the EU's climate change monitoring programme Copernicus calculates that we have already reached 1.2 degrees centigrade of warming. So that target of a maximum of 1.5 degrees C is looking unrealistic. So should we bolster our current efforts in holding companies and governments to account and double down on meeting ever more ambitious targets? Or is there another approach? Could radical technology be the answer? We also have to ask, what effect has COVID had on all this? In the media, we hear a lot about the potential positive effects of a lockdown on carbon emissions and nature, but are these positive effects actually detectable, and do they outweigh the negative effects of conservation taking a back seat? And what can we do to make sure that when the immediate health crisis of the pandemic starts to ease, we shift the focus back onto biodiversity conservation for the ultimate benefit of humans and wildlife? Our 2 panellists, Dr. Hugh Hunt and Dr. Chris Sandbrook, are going to briefly give an overview of their work and how it fits into this picture. I'm going to hand over to Chris now.
Thank you very much indeed, Ellie, for that wonderful introduction, and to Pint of Science for the invitation to be here this evening. As Ellie said, climate change is a major driver of biodiversity loss, And biodiversity loss also drives climate change. For example, when we lose forests that play a crucial role in sequestering carbon. And it is therefore vitally important that we understand biodiversity loss and climate change as linked crises. We can't address one without the other. And dealing with this was complicated enough, but then in the last year, we've had thrown into the mix the terrible experience of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has had profound impacts on wildlife conservation as on all other aspects of our lives. And I'm just briefly going to introduce some of those issues from a conservation perspective over the next couple of minutes. So in the early stages of lockdown, particularly for us here in the UK, there was some sense of optimism around COVID from a conservation perspective. The weather was warm, the spring was beautiful, the streets were quiet, and this reduction in human activity because of lockdown, which has sometimes been called the anthropause, was seen as very beneficial for species that are directly impacted by human disturbance. And people were also connecting with nature in their gardens and in their local parks in ways which could have really important positive benefits for their mental health, and possibly in converting more people to the conservation cause as they realize just how amazing nature is. But unfortunately, it is now clear that these short-term benefits are being outweighed by some very serious medium and long-term costs from a conservation perspective that are a result of the pandemic. So a team of us at the Cambridge Conservation Initiative decided to generate a compendium of all the possible impacts that COVID might have on conservation, both positive and negative. And we then asked experts from around the world to rank them according to how likely they thought they were to happen and how serious and impactful they would be if they did happen. And what you see on the screen here is the ranking that we came out with when we compiled all the scores. And you can also see that the top 9 most highly ranked impacts were all negative, ranging from direct harm to nature from things like deforestation, habitat loss, to reduced funding for the conservation sector because governments and donors are understandably turning their attention to other issues during a pandemic. And only number 10 on the top 10 list was a positive impact to do with new restrictions on wildlife trade because of the associations between specific species like pangolins and bats and the emergence of zoonotic diseases like COVID-19. So this picture is really not looking very good, but these were predictions rather than documented events. So we do still have some opportunities to think about how we could shape the future for conservation post COVID-19. And I've been working with 2 colleagues, Bill Adams and Eric Gomez-Bakatoon, to look at some of the broad scenarios that exist for society as we think about how to engage with conservation after the pandemic. So the first of these, which we came up with, is basically a return to business as usual. We could just try to reset the clock, pretend that COVID never happened, and carry on as before, which, as we know, and as Ellie has very clearly laid out, would be very problematic for wildlife and for climate change. So probably not a very good idea. The second option, which might be even worse, is to really go for broke in trying to restore and boost the global economy, measured in terms of GDP, by effectively cashing in on our natural capital stock. So trying to sell off nature, chopping down forests, exploiting the soil, trying to make the most money we can out of nature in the short term, but with very harmful consequences in the long term, both for biodiversity and also for climate change. The third option we see is more of a green recovery. So using technology solutions, using maybe market-based interventions and government stimulus packages to try and find a greener form of capitalism. This is in effect doing the best we can within the prevailing political economic system which we already had pre-COVID. And it's somewhat like what Joe Biden and other political leaders have been talking about. And the final option is a more transformative form of economic reconstruction that moves away from this infinite GDP growth model in the economy. This would entail stronger action on things like convergence in global consumption trends, perhaps a degrowth approach to the economy, strong carbon taxes, and other measures. This is a more radical social and environmental program, which might be more difficult to achieve, but perhaps would help us to get to where we want to be in terms of biodiversity and climate. So the pandemic, obviously a disaster, does open up some space to do things a little differently in future, perhaps to reset our relationship with nature. And we saw after the 2008 financial crisis that perhaps a similar opportunity, which was really missed. Instead, vast sums were spent propping up the previous system, which now looks ready to fail again. So my view is it's critical that we don't do the same again this time. And I look forward to discussing with the panelists and the audience some of the issues which we've brought up so far. So for now, I'm going to hand over to Hugh Hunt, who will introduce his part of the session.
Well, thank you very much. It is, of course, a distressing situation we're in. And I guess I'm going to pick up on something that Ellie said before, that the Arctic is pretty important to us. And I think we've really got to think hard about the Arctic. And then, of course, the Antarctic. The timescales as well are pretty important. Now, if you think back to the slide that Ellie showed, which showed the global temperatures, well, 100 years ago, that shows 1912 to 1916, compared with the baseline kind of around the 1950s, 60s, 70s, everything looks quite cool. But if you then go to the present day, which is more like 2012, 2016, look, you can see things are warmer, but notice particularly the Arctic up in the north, where it's definitely a lot warmer. And that's really a significant issue for us. Now, what are the issues for the Arctic? The Arctic is basically white. It's got lots of ice. And this albedo, the reflectivity of the Arctic, helps to keep the Arctic cool. But if ice floating on the Arctic in the summer were to melt away, then it's going to kind of reinforce the warming by not being able to reflect away sunlight. This then means that methane, which is perhaps about 120 times more potent a greenhouse gas than CO2, can be released from permafrost. That's kind of vegetation that's locked, frozen underneath the Arctic. And then, of course, the Greenland ice shelf holds, well, if it all melts, and that's unlikely in the short term, but if it's got 7.5 meters of sea level rise locked up in it. And we've seen as well that the disturbance that a warming Arctic is causing to our weather patterns, well, we've seen all sorts of things that's been causing to our lifestyle. Well, now, let's try and visualize this loss of ice. Imagine, as probably some of you are now, you're sitting down with your evening gin and tonic or whatever it might be, and you've got an ice cube in there. And if your ice cube starts to melt, which it does, it kind of, you think, well, when will I put a new ice cube in? If it got to this sort of size, you'd think, oh, well, it's nearly all gone. Well, unfortunately, that is the predicament we're in with ice in the Arctic, that the summer ice has reduced to that kind of level. So we really ought to be, just as we would with our drink at home, we ought to be concerned. Now, there is technology, of course, that we're relying on to reduce CO2 emissions. But just have a look here. If we use the year 2000 as a baseline, globally, we've increased our fossil fuel use by 50%. And you think, well, that's because population has risen. Well, hang on a second. Yes, but that doesn't explain it all. In fact, we're using more energy per person around the planet. Well, surely we're creating energy more efficiently. Solar, wind. No, we're not. So technology is not coming to our rescue. So then we have to think, all right, well, what do we do? This pandemic, the COVID pandemic, surely that's going to have cut emissions. Well, look at this picture here. You'll discover that the Great Depression, the Second World War, oil crises, all sorts of things. It's not slowed down our generation of fossil fuels. So the area that I work in is this area called geoengineering, which is active control of the climate. Now, it's pretty scary because if we carry on doing things like flying, and flying produces 5 tons is my carbon footprint if I fly to Australia, it's crazy. We're probably going to need these kinds of technologies. And the issue is that if we start now, or even if we started 20 years ago cutting our emissions, we might have had a gentle landing. But it turns out that we haven't started 20 years ago. We've started now. It's kind of, we've got to come down a really steep curve. And we've got to think that if we've got a target of something like 2050, then we really ought to have interim targets to think about what we should be doing. And the issue is scale. And unfortunately, Chris, the biodiversity will suffer when we start thinking about just how much of this carbon dioxide drawdown removal we're going to do. It's going to take up a lot of land area. That's something we really need to think about.
So thank you very much to our speakers and to Ellie, our moderator, for this introduction. And now we really would like to hear from you. I think we with a lot of food for thought. What do you think about it? We have seen that I'm sure many of us have hoped that the COVID pandemic could help more our efforts towards a greener world. And we saw that it may not have been the case, but what do you think about it? What do you think it could be important for us to tackle? What do you want to ask our speakers and our moderator? So please leave your questions in the comment section, and I will now leave the stage to Ellie to start the discussion. And really don't feel afraid to share your thoughts and your questions here in the comments.
Well, first of all, to kick off, I was thinking, I kind of want to clear something up. So the way that conservation and global warming are talked about often sounds like we're kind of equating them. Should we always consider reducing atmospheric carbon dioxide and maintaining biodiversity as part of the same objective? Or should we be focusing on them separately in any cases? I'll send that first to Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Ellie. I mean, as I said, I think we have to think of them as interlinked crises, and we have to recognise that anything that we do to address one will have implications for the other. But sometimes those implications are negative, and Hugh, I think, just started to pick up on that in his comments. So, for example, if we decide that we want to use nature-based solutions, as they're sometimes called, to try and address climate change by using trees, for example, to sequester carbon, we have to think about what kind of trees are those going to be and where are they in the world. So, as a conservationist, I would like to promote the use of natural forest or restored natural forest as the best solution. But it might be tempting, for example, to carpet the landscape in quick-growing pine species in monoculture that will hoover up lots of carbon very quickly, but could actually be very, very harmful from a biodiversity perspective, and indeed from the point of view of the livelihoods of people living in those areas. And when we see maps of the world of where negative emissions interventions are planned to take place, it does alarm me. I think about the people and the ecosystems that are living in those places. So yeah, we need to think about them together, but also recognizing that sometimes what we do for one might not be supportive of the other.
Is that how you take it as well, Hugh?
I do, except that when you start thinking of the time scales, we perhaps only have 10 years or so before irreversible melting of the Arctic has happened. Yet it might take 20 or 30 years for newly planted forests to get to a point of maturity where they are substantially absorbing CO2. So it's a real trade-off. And then to add to that, we've got kind of technological solutions which make it very difficult to think about nice biodiversity. For instance, the Drax power station in the north of England, which is importing wood chip from North America, transporting it over the Atlantic in ships, and then burning it in power stations in order to generate our electricity in a green fashion. And I'm not sure, maybe Chris has got a comment on that, but it just doesn't feel right to me that we should be planting forests with the express purpose of cutting them down and burning them.
And what would you suggest, though? So geoengineering is an alternative to that.
It's not an alternative. It's absolutely not an alternative. We've got to be planting trees, and we've got to not be cutting down existing trees. I mean, that's like, it's crazy. You know, if you've got a broken arm, don't cut off your other arm. It just seems silly. We've got to be protecting the really beautiful virgin native forests that we've got. Yes, restore those that we can, but I fear that if we're relying for negative emissions on forests, I think it's going to be very hard to maintain biodiversity in those forests.
That's really interesting. I'm glad we cleared that up right at the start. I want to head over to the audience questions, first of all, but I'm sure it's something we can come back to. So Adnan asks, is there anyone actively working about moving away from the constant growth economy model? And will it succeed considering the vested interest and where power and money lies? This is one I want to send over to Chris first, because I think this is something that I also think about a lot. You know, if we talk about zero growth economies, sounds like a nice idea. Is it practical?
Yeah, this is, I mean, I'm tempted to say it's the $1 million question, but maybe that's not even the right metric, because we should be calling it the $0 question, because we're talking about no growth. Yeah, there are lots of people thinking about this. I mean, one person who's quite prominent in the public discourse in the UK is Kate Raworth at the University of Oxford, who has the donut economics model, which is well worth having a look at if you're not aware of that. There are many scholars working on ideas like degrowth. I think that the kind of take-home message for me from all of that work is that it is completely feasible. You know, one can imagine a set of policy interventions, you know, a restructuring of the global economy that would deliver on the objectives that we're talking about. However, the second part of your question, you know, rightly raises the question of power and vested interest. There are many actors in our world who would not be very keen on that happening. So while it's feasible, plausible to imagine that kind of transition, whether we can actually achieve that in the short term is a huge challenge. But what I would say to that is that, you know, the current system that we have is a radical system. I mean, in terms of the way we're living on the planet, we are living in a ridiculous system. You know, so we really need to change it. So the idea that, oh well, it's too hard to change, we better stick with the status quo, isn't going to get us anywhere that we want to be. So you know, it is feasible, but it's going to take a lot of effort from many different places, and I think particularly citizen and voter power will be the essential ingredient to try and make some of these more profound changes happen.
And when lots of people have lost their jobs and livelihoods during the pandemic, do you think that there's a way for governments to sell green recovery to the citizens without it sounding like they're choosing kind of green initiatives and biodiversity over human lives?
Yeah, absolutely there is, which is to make them connected. So, you know, you want to have large-scale employment programs, probably backed directly by the state, that are connected to this. So, you know, you see green recovery initiatives, you know, green stimulus initiatives, which are talking exactly about creating jobs in the green economy. And you know, when I look at you know, the situation in, you know, relatively impoverished, you know, post-industrial towns in Britain, for example, you know, there are lots of people who are skilled but unemployed and could be, you know, could move into this kind of new sector, you know, building electric cars, all sorts of renewable energy intervention, some of the kind of new technologies that I'm sure Hugh and his lab are developing. I mean, I think that's a very good idea.
So Hugh, what's your take on that? I mean, I know that public perception is something which is quite close to your heart with geoengineering. How much do you consider public perception?
All the time, and it's interesting, you know, the idea that green recovery. Well, now let's you know, electric cars and, you know, green heat pumps. Let's get rid of gas boilers and let's heat our homes with heat pumps. Ultimately, I mean, only about 20% of the UK's energy is consumed through electricity. All the rest is consumed directly by burning fossil fuels. So we burn gas in our homes to heat them. We burn petrol in our cars, and trucks have a diesel, and so on. So when are we going to build that extra 80, increase the 80% of missing energy that's got to be electric? Well, it's going to take decades to do that. And in the meantime, we'll still be burning quite a lot of fossil fuels. So ramping down that consumption requires a bit more than kind of green initiatives, sort of the will to do it. We've really got to do it in spades. And if we kind of think of the incentives that we have to do the right thing, I'm going to give you an example of my last time. The last time I flew to Australia, and I go there frequently because that's where I've got a lot of family, and unfortunately you have to go to funerals and things like that. I was told that I could offset my flight, the CO2 for my flight, by paying £30 on a £1,000 flight. Well, I thought, fantastic. That means that if I paid £60, my flight will be carbon negative, right? Now, you're smiling there because you can tell that just can't be right. Of course it can't be right. Yet, if that's the message we're getting, that if I pay £60, then my flight is carbon negative, that means the more I fly, the better. We're not being given the right incentives, and we really have to, whether we like it or not, we've got to be reducing consumption really dramatically. And I don't know how we get that message across. We have to turn that curve down. Otherwise, if we're relying on technology to do it, I really fear for biodiversity.
And something you've mentioned there about, the idea that if we can, capture our carbon, theoretically, it might make us a little bit complacent. I mean, is there a risk that if we show that actual carbon capture or solar radiation management technologies are practical, that this could make governments sort of take their foot off the pedal when it comes to reducing emissions? Yeah,
well, of course, that's a danger. I better explain that term. Solar radiation management is this really quite scary idea that we could spray stuff up into the high atmosphere to reflect sunlight, and on the face of it, it sounds really kind of Frankenstein science, but it is in a way a natural thing because volcanic eruptions have done that over thousands, millions of years. Mount Pinatubo back in 1991 was a big volcanic eruption which caused nearly a degree of cooling globally over a period of a year. Would it be a good idea to explore options for cooling the planet in that way? Now, people straight away say, look, no, we shouldn't be never should we be doing that, for exactly the reasons you say, Ellie, that it kind of feels like a get out of jail free card for the fossil fuel industry. If we're going to use that kind of technology, then why should we bother reducing our emissions? But it's kind of like saying, I'll have a lung transplant, but I'll keep on smoking. We've got to accept the fact that if you're going to have a lung transplant, the deal is that you stop smoking, full stop. So if ever we're going to use any of these really quite, completely unnecessary technologies, unnecessary because we could so easily avoid using them if we just stop burning fossil fuels, well, we've got to stop burning fossil fuels. I don't know how politically that happens, but boy, we can't be using scary technologies without an absolute determination to stop burning fossil fuels.
I want to go into that in more detail, but I've just seen that we've got another audience question. So I'm going to send this to you, I think, Chris, first. So
you better not, Ellie, because I literally don't know what the IEA special report is. So
okay.
I won't be able to give a good answer, I'm afraid.
Hugh, would you like to take this one?
No, I don't. What is the IEA special report?
Oh, okay. Well, maybe we should. Maybe if Rian could send us a little link in the comments, but we'll move on to the next one. So this is from Adnan. Hugh, can you give any examples of the geoengineering ideas that could scale in the time we have available?
Well, so the thing about timescales is that any technologies that are about removal of carbon dioxide or removal of methane or removal of greenhouse gases are going to take a while. The curve bringing the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere down going to take a while, not only because they're the time scales of the ocean and the trees and the soil, but also because those technologies don't exist yet at scale. So my view is that the quick actions, which we may decide we need, are to do with reflecting sunlight. So it's a little bit like if you're outside and it's very sunny, you can cool yourself pretty quickly by going and walking under a tree in the shade. That's kind of a quick fix. Trying to cool the atmosphere, turning the air conditioning on in your house takes time for the temperature to change. So spraying particles in the stratosphere sounds scary, but it may turn out to be an option which we wouldn't want to use. We really wouldn't want to use for a long period of time, but it could be a stopgap option which we need. And then what else? Making clouds whiter. That's another one which people have talked about. They're the main ones, really.
And Chris, what are your thoughts on large-scale geoengineering? Is it something that you kind of think can be incorporated alongside traditional biodiversity conservation?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I probably just about agree with Hugh on this, that it's sensible with the trajectories that we're on to be doing some R&D to understand what our options might be in an absolute total emergency. I also think that the risk of complacency, there's a kind of human instinct to embrace technology as the solution to all of our problems and effectively kick the can down the road when it comes to dealing with fossil fuel emissions or even dealing with other kind of social issues that we have. So I think that the key is to do the research, but to couple it with very, very strong messaging that this is the kind of red button that you only press when you have to, not the solution. And I think we've seen this. Some of the world's wealthiest men have been talking about colonizing new planets in space as a kind of long-term strategy, literally for conservation of biodiversity. I mean, Jeff Bezos has talked about setting up mining colonies on other planets so that we can leave Earth protected and behind us. And I think surely we can do better than that. We've got a planet here which is kind of perfect for us to live on, and so if our best option to protect it is to go and colonize another planet, then I think we can do better than that. And I think the same is true of geoengineering.
Well, Phil,
I couldn't agree with you more. It's just so it's so sad that we're even thinking about these technologies. And but my view is that as long as anyone is thinking about them, there ought to be research done to be at least basically confident that these technologies, if ever we had to push this red button, that they'd be safe. A little bit like chemotherapy. You don't wish chemotherapy on a friend, but if ever it's needed, you'd like to think that it's going to be done safely.
I mean, this is all the assumption that something can be done. We're talking about this as the worst case scenario. Phil raises an interesting question, which I guess is the most important question. Is the planet even savable at this point, or is it too late? What are your thoughts, Chris?
Well, I think, yeah, good question. The first question is, what do we mean by the planets, right? So if planet Earth is going to keep going for a very long time, most likely without us, I'm sure, at some point in the future. If we're talking about the planet as we know it, the biodiversity with which we share it, the way in which we've been able to live our lives, it is going to be more challenging. I mean, I think without any doubt at all, humanity and our kind of fellow travelers on the planet can get through the crises we're in decent shape. I don't think we're locked into the end of days in some kind of terrible way, but we are going to lose a lot of species that we're with. We're going to lose a lot more habitat to be able to produce the food and energy that we need. So there are going to be some big changes in the future and some big trade-offs that we have to negotiate. But I don't think it's too late. I don't think we should all stop having children tomorrow and kind of pull up the shutters and get onto the spaceship. I think we still have time to do something about this.
What do you think, Hugh? Do you have the same level of optimism, cautious optimism, I suppose?
I do. I don't think it's too late, but I do think we are going to have to rethink things like how much do we rely on aviation. Our own personal aviation is not the big deal. To be honest, there's a lot of corporate aviation, frequent flyers. Anyone who flies more than 5 hours a year is a frequent flyer, and dare I say, you know who you are, and myself included. So we've got to think hard about it. Well, for instance, my niece in Australia inviting me to her wedding, and I say, look, I can't go to your wedding, and she says, oh, please come to my wedding. I said, look, carbon footprint is too big, but here's the deal. I will give you £1,000, which would have been my plane ticket, as a wedding present. Now, of course, all of a sudden she's delighted that I'm not going to her wedding. So we have to reframe the way we think, because it's a no-brainer. Why should I even think about going to this wedding when I could spend £1,000 on a lovely wedding present, which can be a down payment on a house? Our attitude towards consumption and emissions has to change. But then the next thing as well is, in answer to the question, is it too late? I think the oceans are a very special place, and we haven't been kind to our oceans. We've seen on the television recently that the oceans, we've really been horrible to the ocean. But perhaps we can really get the oceans back on side as our friend, and make the ocean productive so that it can get back to really sucking up a lot of CO2 for us. And I'm pretty optimistic that is a way forward. And I guess we haven't talked much about the oceans. Perhaps Chris has got something he could add on that.
Well, only to say that from a biodiversity point of view, absolutely agree that marine life is totally wonderful and crucial to the processes on which we all depend. I'm not sure, Hugh, were you kind of hinting at some algal farm in the deep ocean there? I wasn't quite sure what you were driving at. I might have more concerns about that.
Well, I'm not so much talking about actively farming, but I just think that if we protect the health of the oceans, so for instance, if we've got river runoff which is full of nitrates, which is making the oceans less biodiverse and less productive, then the amount of life in the oceans reflects the amount of CO2 that the oceans can take up.
So at the moment, there's quite a hot topic, which is undersea or deep sea mining. Is that something that concerns you? Okay, we'll go to you, Hugh. I feel like you have some strong opinions here.
Oh, well, look, I just feel that the scale on which we have to do things, we've seen already these huge coal mines that we've needed to maintain our lifestyle. Well, it really worries me that the scale that we need to do things can happen underwater invisibly. And it really, really worries me. If we can't see it, are we really sure that it's being done responsibly? And I worry about the fishing, large-scale fishing, drag nets on the bottom of the sea. We don't see it. Of course, if we did drag nets if we harvested wildlife in forests with drag nets, I mean, there would be an outcry. Yes, I really do worry about the regulatory framework around deep sea mining.
Do you have some?
I couldn't agree more. I think Hugh mentioned before that we need to stop burning fossil fuels, and probably we also need to stop over-consuming some other kind of rare earth minerals that might be dug out of deep sea mines. And it does frustrate me enormously to think at the time that we need to be sort of stopping or downscaling what we're doing. Instead, we're still pushing out to explore new frontiers of extraction, and the risks that come with deep sea mining are just so huge in every possible way almost that you could think of. I can't see it working. I mean, the only counter argument to that I've heard from colleagues, for example, in the Pacific, is you've got island economies which have previously been heavily dependent on tourism and nature-based tourism, which has stopped completely for the last 12-15 months, and they're desperate. Their economy has gone up in smoke. So they have resources in the deep sea that they could potentially cash in on, and I think that's where some kind of global cooperation is needed to help those countries out, so that they don't have to turn to that unsustainable solution.
So Hannah,
there's a perspective on that, if I can add, which is a little bit it's a bit odd, which is that if you buy an electric car, you need all these minerals for your batteries and for your motors and so on. It doesn't matter whether you end up driving that electric car for 100 kilometers or 1,000,000 kilometers. If during the lifetime of that car you don't drive it very far, it still has used the same. It's got the same mineral extraction footprint. Now, I would argue then that we ought to be having a new model where we really don't own our own cars. We do what perhaps it might seem silly, but public transport is not a bad model. And car sharing is not a bad model. And taking taxis is not a bad model. So imagine a world where we just got used to the idea that we don't own our own car. And when we want to go somewhere, we dial up a taxi or an Uber or whatever it is, and it's an electric Uber. But that globally, the number of cars on the planet reduces to a tiny fraction of what it is now. Maybe we wouldn't need these vast mineral extraction facilities that looks like we're on target to get.
It's a really good point, and I suppose the problem again is the sort of economic impetus towards that kind of model, because at the moment you call up a taxi or an Uber, it's still pretty expensive. I mean, cars are expensive, but maybe you're spreading it over a longer period. It's very tricky. Before we wrap up, I want to make sure we get Hannah's question in. So Hannah's asked, how can we encourage people to be more connected with nature? What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. This is a crucially important issue for the whole conservation movement, is how to try and make sure people are more connected with nature. It's good for them. It's good for the conservation movement to have supporters. But we also know that people are increasingly living in cities. There's some arguments that it might make sense to have strictly protected areas for nature in one place, and then humans living elsewhere in more productive agricultural landscapes and cities. And that comes with disconnection from nature. So there's a strange kind of paradox that our efforts to protect nature are also disconnecting us. So, I mean, there are lots of things that we know work. Urban green spaces are a good way of connecting people with nature. Exposure to biodiversity in schools seems to work really well. I've done some research on actually the role of computer games and digital representations of nature. So things like Pokemon Go and so on, which could potentially be harnessed in a way which is positive for connections with nature, or they could go the other way and disconnect. So yeah, it's a very active research area, and one which is going to be critically important, because what we don't want is a super efficient society where people live in highly efficient buildings and live highly efficient lives in cities, but never get to experience the nature that we've managed to protect in distant forests and mountains and other parts of the world. So I think that would be an impoverished experience of life.
We just have time for one more quick question before we go. I don't know, Hugh or Chris, if you've ever had this thought, whether you might become a politician, but if you did become a politician, what would be your first choice to make things better? I'm going to
Can I just say that it was only a couple of years ago that we were talking about how desperately we needed a third runway at Heathrow Airport. And that conversation kind of has disappeared for the time being because we're flying a lot less. But what struck me about that whole conversation was that politically it seemed to be essential for the economy of Britain that we needed a third runway at Heathrow. Politically, though, climate change, in 50 years' time, we're going to be flying less. I can just assure you, we're going to be flying less. We've got to have politicians that understand climate change, that tell us the truth, and that know about the numbers, and that know how to make solutions that add up. And it's interesting how, when it comes to negative emissions, the government is currently talking about cost-effective climate change measures. Well, hold on. Why do they need to be cost-effective? None of the vaccine processes and all the contact tracing, that was not cost-effective. That was just done at any cost. Why is it that measures to deal with climate change need to be cost-effective? Our politicians got a perverse view on this. We've got to get them being numerate and honest.
And Chris, if you were a politician, what would you do?
I think possibly the one thing I would love to do is see GDP abolished as a sort of metric, and GDP growth as a fundamental target for the measure of success. We always GDP is going to go up by 1%, 1.2%. It should be stable or falling, really. And GDP is a terrible metric for what really matters, both for us as people and our well-being, and for nature and the planet. So, yeah, I'm sure if Hugh or I arrived in office on our first day and announced our top priorities, we'd probably be booted out immediately. But in a perfect world, that would be what I would like to do.
Okay, so yeah, some forward thinking there. Well, I think it's safe to say that we carry on talking about this for hours. There's a reason why it's a topic that evokes so much, so many strong opinions, because ultimately it really matters. And even within the scientific community, there isn't really a consensus on one right thing to do to save the world. And even if they were, I suppose, it depends on political clout to get it going. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time because there are other exciting Pint of Science events waiting to take up the stream. So we do need to wrap up. Well, thank you so much, Chris and Hugh, for an insightful and thought-provoking discussion. And also thank you to everyone in the audience who sent in their stimulating questions and thoughts, and ultimately helped us steer this conversation along. So I'm going to hand back to Michaela now for her roundup.
I would like to thank you all for being here with us and to lead us to have this really amazing discussion. And if I can say so, I would like to remind everybody that as Chris and you said, it's not too late. So we really should start thinking about our action and do what we can to make things better for the next generations. And I really would like to thank our amazing speakers and our amazing moderator for their really interesting insights on the problem. And last but not least, let's take a moment to thank the people behind the scenes that made this event possible. So we will be sharing their names in the screen in a moment. It was really, really lovely to have you here with us, and we really hope that next year we will be all able to meet again in a pub and hopefully without masks. So have a lovely evening and thank you for being with us.